The medals were wrapped in a dish towel because Mara Sexton didn't own a jewelry box. She'd driven to the shop on a Tuesday morning, early enough that the parking lot was empty except for a pickup with a cracked bumper sticker. Army Strong, sun-bleached to the color of old bone. She sat in her car for 11 minutes before she got out. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the dashboard clock the way she used to watch the clock in the trauma bay, counting seconds between compressions, waiting for a pulse that wasn't coming. Bowie was in the back seat. He was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, with a diagonal scar across his right shoulder from a piece of shrapnel in Kandahar that had been meant for her. He watched her through the rear window as she walked toward the door of Harlan's military surplus and pawn, and something in his posture, the stillness of it, the way his ears didn't lower the way they did when he was relaxed, made her hesitate at the door. She went in anyway. The man behind the counter looked up. He was in his mid-40s, with the kind of hands that had built things and broken things in equal measure. His name tag said Cal. He had a jaw like a shelf and eyes that went quiet when he saw the dish towel in her hands, the way it moved like it held something heavier than fabric. "Help you?" he said. Mara set the towel on the glass counter and unfolded it. There were 3 items: an Army Commendation Medal with a V device, Valor, a combat action badge, and a small bronze medallion, unofficial, the kind soldiers have made for themselves, that said 759th FST, her forward surgical team, the unit that had operated on 18 soldiers in a 12-hour period during the Helmand Offensive, when the field hospital was flooded and they worked on a wooden platform in 6 inches of water because there was nowhere else to go. Cal didn't touch them. He just looked. "I need to know what you'd give me," Mara said. Her voice was level. She had made it level in the car, practiced the sentence the way she used to practice IV insertions on oranges at 19 years old, before she knew what a real vein felt like. "I'm not looking for full value. I just need to know a number." Cal looked up from the medals. He looked at her, at the circles under her eyes that had been there for 43 days now, at the way she held her shoulders like she was waiting for someone to tell her to stand down, at the name stitched on the breast pocket of her jacket, Sexton. The kind that came standard on Army field jackets, and that she'd clearly never taken off because there was nowhere else to wear it anymore. He said, "Can I ask what branch?" "Army. 2 tours." She didn't elaborate. She'd learned not to. He nodded once. Then he opened his mouth to say something, and that was the moment Mara heard the door open behind her. She turned. Bowie had pushed the car door open. She'd left the window cracked. She always did, a habit from the years when he'd needed ventilation after his surgeries, and he had widened it with his paw and come out. He walked across the parking lot without hurrying, pushed through the pawn shop door the same way, and went straight to the counter. He put his front paws up on the glass. His nose went to the medals, not the towel, the medals themselves, the cold metal, and he pressed his face into them and made a sound, low, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, and he didn't move. Mara said, "Bowie, down." He didn't move. Bowie. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. She hadn't meant it to. She hadn't cried yet, not in 43 days, not when the certified letter arrived from the hospital's legal team, not when the state nursing board sent the notice of investigation, not when she'd sat in her car outside the grocery store and done the math on her checking account 3 times because the number kept being wrong. She hadn't cried, and she wasn't going to cry in a pawn shop, but her dog had his face pressed into her medals and he wouldn't move, and she didn't know what to do with that. Cal was watching Bowie. His expression had changed. It was the expression of a man doing arithmetic he hadn't expected to be doing. "Is he a service animal?" he asked. "Was," Mara said. "He's retired. He was Army. Now he's just mine." "What was his MOS?" She almost smiled. "ID detection. Helmand Province, 2017 through 2019. Cal came around from behind the counter. He crouched down to Bowie's level, not in front of him, to the side, the way someone does when they know dogs and know that eye contact from a stranger is a challenge, not a greeting. He looked at the scar on Bowie's shoulder. Then he looked at the V device on the commendation medal. "What happened?" he asked, and he wasn't asking about the medal. Mara Sexton had been a nurse for 9 years, 6 of them in the Army and 3 at Duluth Regional Medical Center, where she worked nights in the emergency department because nights were the only shift that felt honest to her. The city stripped down, no performance, just the work. She'd been good at the work. She knew that without arrogance, the way she knew her own blood type. She could read a monitor the way other people read faces. She knew when a patient was turning before the numbers said so. Dr. Aldous Fenwick, the attending who'd supervised her first 6 months at Duluth Regional, had told the department head that Mara Sexton had the best clinical instincts he'd seen in a decade of practice. She kept that comment in the same category as her medals, true private, not for display. The problem started in February. A patient came in, Gerald Ostrander, 61, presenting with respiratory distress. Not the same Ostrander. That was a coincidence, or maybe it wasn't. Mara would think later, the way the name sat in the room like smoke she couldn't quite locate. She administered the medication protocol as ordered. Gerald Ostrander's breathing stabilized. She logged everything. 2 hours later, she was checking the medication cart and she found the dosage records didn't match. Not her records, the pharmacy dispensing logs. Someone had altered them. The quantity listed as dispensed was 30% higher than what had been administered. The difference, on paper, didn't exist. She flagged it. She wrote it up the way she'd been trained, internal incident report, copy to the charge nurse, copy to pharmacy. Nothing happened. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Different patient, same class of medication, same discrepancy. This time, the patient, a 68-year-old retired postal worker named Frank Calley, didn't stabilize. Frank Calley died at 4:17 in the morning while Mara was at his bedside, and the cause of death listed on the chart was cardiac arrhythmia secondary to sepsis, which was accurate and also incomplete, the way a sentence can be true and still lie by what it leaves out. She went to the director of nursing. She put everything on the table, both incidents, both dates, the dispensing logs she'd photographed with her phone, the discrepancy in the numbers. She said, "I think there is a systematic problem with how medications are being tracked on this floor, and I think it's causing patient harm." The director of nursing, a woman named Beverly Holt, a different Holt, again not connected, listened, took notes, said she would look into it. 2 weeks after that, Mara was called into a meeting with HR and the hospital's legal liaison. She was told that multiple colleagues had raised concerns about her performance, that her military background, while respected, had perhaps left her with certain tendencies, hypervigilance, a pattern of seeing threats that weren't present, that were affecting her judgment, that in the interest of everyone involved, she was being placed on administrative suspension, with pay, pending a formal review. The suspension with pay lasted 9 days. Then it became suspension without pay, pending a nursing board investigation into her documentation practices. The board investigation was opened by a complaint filed not by a patient, not by a family member, but by the hospital itself. Mara had $2,400 in her checking account on the day she received that notice. She had $847 left by the day she drove to Harlan's military surplus and pawn with her medals wrapped in a dish towel. She had not told anyone, not her mother in Fargo, not the 2 Army friends she still texted, not the VA counselor she saw every 3rd Tuesday. She was 31 years old, and she had survived 2 combat deployments and a motorcycle accident at 24 and a February in the Helmand Valley when they ran out of blood products for 4 days, and she had improvised with what she had, and she had survived all of it, and she was not going to tell anyone that she was losing. Except Bowie knew. He had known for weeks. He'd started sleeping pressed against her legs instead of at the foot of the bed. He'd started watching the door when she got up at night. He was doing what he'd been trained to do, detect the thing that was wrong, stay close to the person who needed him. And she had been pretending not to notice because noticing meant admitting. And then he'd pressed his face into her medals and refused to move, and something in her chest had broken open like a pressure seal. Cal Whitfield was not a counselor, and he was not a social worker, and he was 44 years old, with a hardware store he ran in the mornings and a pawn operation in the afternoons, and absolutely no business asking a stranger to sit down and tell him her life. He'd done 2 tours himself, Army Ranger, 75th Regiment, Mosul, and then Logar Province, And he'd come home to Duluth because his uncle had left him the building and because Duluth was far enough north that the winters kept the population honest. He made Mara a cup of coffee on the hot plate he kept behind the counter. He gave Bowie a piece of beef jerky, which Bowie accepted gravely and then ate in one bite without looking away from Mara's face. She told Cal the story. Not the whole story at first. She gave him the compressed version, the one that fit inside 3 minutes, the same version she'd told the nursing board investigator. But Cal asked questions the way someone asks when they're actually listening, not when they're waiting for their turn to talk. And the 3-minute version became a longer version. And by the time she got to the part about Frank Callie dying at 4:17 in the morning, her coffee was cold. Cal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was the medication?" She told him the drug class, a specific category of IV analgesics, the kind used in post-surgical pain management. Cal's jaw shifted, just slightly, the way a person's face moves when a number clicks into place that they didn't know they were looking for. There was a story in the Tribune, he said. About 4 months ago, a pharmaceutical company, Velspar Medical, settled a kickback lawsuit in Wisconsin. They'd been paying bonuses to hospital procurement officers who increased orders of their IV medications beyond patient need. The overage got billed to insurance. The bonuses were paid as consulting fees. Mara stared at him. Velspar, she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. She knew the same way she knew when a patient was turning. Not because the monitors said so, but because everything in her was reading the room and the room was saying yes. Velspar Medical had a supply contract with Duluth Regional. She had seen their logo on the dispensing units. She had thought nothing of it the way she thought nothing of the wallpaper. She pulled out her phone. She found the photographs she'd taken of the dispensing logs, the ones she'd been carrying for 6 weeks without knowing what to do with them. She put the phone on the counter. Cal looked at the photographs for a long time. He said, "My neighbor is a retired Army colonel. Colonel Ray Deering. He did a second career with the VA Inspector General's office. He retired 2 years ago. He looked up. If what you have in these photographs is what I think it is, he's going to want to see them." Mara said, "I've already filed reports. Nothing happened." Cal said, "You filed reports inside the system. Ray spent 12 years investigating what happens when the system is the problem." Bowie was sitting next to Mara's leg now. He had placed himself precisely, not in front, not behind, but to the left, at the exact angle a trained military working dog takes when it's guarding a handler's blind side. Mara put her hand on his head without thinking about it. He leaned in the way he did, and the weight of him against her palm was 7 years of accumulated steadiness. She picked up the medals from the counter. Cal didn't say anything about that. He just nodded. Ray Deering lived 4 blocks from Harlan's in a house with a flag out front and a garden that was aggressively well-maintained. He was 68, with a white crew cut and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second, because he was a man who believed efficiency was a form of respect. He looked at Mara's photographs for 40 minutes. He asked 6 questions, none of them small. He asked about the specific lot numbers on the medications, which she had not photographed but could recall. She had the kind of memory that had been trained by years of emergency documentation, the ability to hold numbers the way other people hold sentences. He asked about the date range of the discrepancies. He asked whether the patients affected had any connection to one another. He asked whether she had retained any copies of her original internal reports before they were filed. She had. She'd emailed them to her personal account the same night she'd submitted them, a habit from the Army, where paperwork had a way of disappearing when it was inconvenient. Ray Deering looked at Cal. Cal looked at Mara. Ray said, "I'm going to make some phone calls." "To who?" Mara asked. "The VA Inspector General's office still has people I trust, and the State Medical Board's investigative arm has a unit that handles exactly this kind of institutional complaint. What you filed before went to the hospital's compliance office, which reports to the hospital's board, which includes Frank Ostrander." The room went very quiet. "The director of Duluth Regional," Ray said, "is named Frank Ostrander. His brother-in-law is the regional sales director for Velspar Medical." Mara heard the words. She arranged them. She had known there was a wall she kept hitting, and she had assumed the wall was her credibility, her record, the PTSD narrative they had built around her carefully, the way you build scaffolding around something you intend to demolish. She had not known until right now that the wall had a name and a brother-in-law and a consulting fee. She said, "How long have they been doing this?" Ray said, "That's what we're going to find out." 3 weeks after that conversation, a black sedan sat parked across the street from Mara's apartment building for 4 hours on a Thursday evening. She noticed it because she was a person who noticed things, and because Bowie noticed it first. He went to the window and stood there with his ears forward and his tail low, which was not his relaxed posture and was not his threatening posture, but was something in between, a vigilance she recognized as meaning, "This is real. Pay attention." She called Cal. He came over with Ray Deering, and Ray made another phone call, and within an hour there was a VA law enforcement officer parked 2 blocks north who had been briefed on the situation and who was, as Ray put it, someone who answers to a different set of bosses. The sedan left at 10 p.m. and didn't come back. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay on her bed with Bowie pressed against her right side, his warm weight rising and falling in a rhythm that was slower than hers, steadier, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about Frank Cali, 68 years old, retired postal worker, who had come in with sepsis and had died at 4:17 in the morning, and whose family had been told it was arrhythmia, and who deserved more than a discrepancy in a dispensing log as a memorial. She thought about all the patients she didn't know, the ones before her, when she hadn't been there to photograph anything, to file anything, to notice. She didn't know how many. She was afraid to think about how many. She put her hand on Bowie's side. He breathed in and out. She said quietly to the ceiling, "I know." The hearing was held on a Friday morning in March in a conference room at the State Health Department building in St. Paul. The table was long and the chairs were gray, and there were 6 members of the medical board's investigative panel seated on one side, and on the other side there was Mara Sexton, her attorney, a woman named Gail Pritchett who had done 12 years in the JAG Corps before going into private practice, and Bowie, who had been granted accommodation as a registered service animal. Frank Ostrander was not there. He had been placed on administrative leave from Duluth Regional 14 days earlier, pending a federal investigation into billing fraud and kickback arrangements with Velspar Medical. His brother-in-law had retained separate legal counsel. Velspar Medical had issued a statement acknowledging an internal review. The panel had before them Mara's original incident reports, the dispensing log photographs, a statement from Ray Deering submitted in his capacity as a former VA IG investigator, billing records obtained by subpoena that showed Duluth Regional had over-ordered 3 medication categories from Velspar Medical by an average of 34% over an 18-month period, and statements from 4 other nurses at Duluth Regional, 2 of whom had filed similar reports that had also been suppressed, and 2 of whom had been terminated in the previous year under circumstances that the panel chairs described carefully as warranting further scrutiny. The panel chair, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at Mara over the top of those glasses when she addressed her directly. She said, "Mrs. Sexton, this panel wants to acknowledge that what you did, documenting, preserving, and escalating this information under significant personal and professional pressure, represents exactly the standard of practice this board exists to protect. We also acknowledge that the process by which you were investigated was initiated through a complaint that this panel now considers to have been filed in bad faith, and that complaint will be formally dismissed." She said other things after that. She said them clearly, and they were all important, and Mara heard every word. But the word that stayed, the one that settled into her chest, like something finally finding its center of gravity after a very long fall, was dismissed. Gail Pritchett touched her arm. Bowie put his head on her knee. He did it the way he had done it at Harlan's military surplus and pawn, in that moment when he'd pressed his face into her metals and refused to let her walk away from who she was. He didn't look up at her. He just rested the full weight of his head against her leg, and she felt his breath slow, and even through the fabric of her slacks, and she put her hand on his head and stayed very still. She did not cry. She had been right about that. She could hold it. She always could. But her throat tightened in a way she recognized as the body's version of acknowledging something true, the way a joint aches before rain. Outside afterward, in the March light that came in gray and honest over the St. Paul streets, Cal Whitfield was waiting by the steps. He hadn't been inside. There was no reason for him to be inside, no formal role, nothing to sign or testify. He'd just driven down from Duluth that morning and parked and waited the way a person does when they've decided that waiting is the right thing to do. He looked at Mara. She said, "It's dismissed." He nodded. He didn't say "I told you," and he didn't say "good," and he didn't say any of the things people say when a thing is over. He just nodded, and something in the nod was sufficient. Bowie went to Cal and sat in front of him with his ears forward and his tail moving once, just once, the minimal version of a greeting from a dog who had decided a person was trustworthy. Cal crouched down and put his hand flat, palm up, and let Bowie sniff it, and then scratched him once behind the ear. Frank Callie's daughter was named Rita. She was 43, and she lived in Duluth, and she had spent 4 months believing her father had died of a heart complication from sepsis, which was what she'd been told, which was not entirely untrue and was not entirely complete. She called Mara 2 weeks after the hearing, on an afternoon when Mara was sitting in her apartment with coffee going cold again, a habit she seemed unable to break, and Bowie's chin on her knee. Rita said, "I heard what happened. Someone sent me a link to the news article." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if it changes anything." "The doctor said it was his heart." Mara said, "Your father was sick. What they did made it worse. The investigation is going to try to determine exactly how much worse. But I want you to know that I was there that night, and I wrote down everything I saw." Another silence. Rita said, "He was proud of nurses. He was proud of military people." She cleared her throat. He had a neighbor who was a nurse who used to check in on him. He used to say that nurses were the ones who actually saw you, not just your chart. Mara said, "He's right." "Were you with him? At the end?" "Yes." "Okay." Rita's voice settled into something that wasn't comfort exactly, but was the shape comfort eventually makes. "Thank you. I just needed to know someone was there." In April, Mara went back to Duluth Regional. Not to her old shift. Her old shift had been absorbed and redistributed, and the department had been through enough restructuring that coming back would have meant coming back to something different, which was maybe accurate and maybe fine. She went back to the ER on a contract basis while the hospital worked through the consequences of an administrative structure that was, as someone's attorney had put it in a filing, compromised at the governance level. She worked nights. She always worked nights. On her first shift back, she walked through the ER doors at 10:58 p.m. with her badge in her bag, and the charge nurse, a man named Will Okafor, who had been there longer than anyone and had a mustache he'd had since 1987 and strong opinions about the placement of supply carts, looked up from the nursing station and said, "Glad you're back, Sexton." He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to. She put her things in her locker, pulled her hair back, washed her hands at the sink. Through the small window above the sink, she could see the parking lot, and in the parking lot, she could see her car, and in her car's back window, she could see the outline of Bowie, watching the building. He was always watching. She dried her hands, she put on her gloves, she went to work. In her locker, folded inside a clean dish towel that she no longer needed to use for this purpose, were her medals. The Army Commendation Medal with the V device, the Combat Action Badge, the small bronze medallion that said 759th FST, for the unit that had operated in 6 inches of water because there was nowhere else to go, because there was work to do, because you did the work with what you had. She had not sold them. She had not needed to sell them in the end. But she had come close enough to the edge to know what the edge looked like, and what had pulled her back was not a system correcting itself, was not paperwork or protocol or the architecture of accountability that was supposed to exist for exactly these moments. What had pulled her back was a dog who had pressed his face into her medals and refused to let her walk away. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone who knows your worth before you've finished, deciding you have any left.